Hello there, this is Adam, and I've got a Acurite weather station. This is model 3N1TXCA1, and this is, I think, one of their cheaper models that still has the slightly more advanced outdoor unit that does wind speed. I think the only thing that this doesn't do is wind direction and rain. But I had gotten an upgrade to this one over Christmas, and so I thought we'd take a look at it here and see what was inside. So this is the outdoor unit. You can definitely tell it's been outside for a while. There were 4 screws that held it in, and each of those rings come off, with the top one having the cups for wind speed. You can see here that there's a magnet on the one side of this bar here. So that probably means that on the other half here, where the cups sit, that there's probably like a reed switch or something in there. So these rings come off, and those rings sort of just act as a shield so that you don't necessarily get the wind affecting the actual temperature reading and stuff. So I'd already taken out the 4 screws that held this together, so not anything too exciting. We'll take a look at the top here. There's a board, and there's definitely a reed switch in there where those the cups sit, the wind cups. There's a retention screw that I'll take out here. So this is a fairly cheap and easy way of measuring the wind speed. I'm sure there's maybe others, but using a magnet and a reed switch is probably the cheapest and easiest. There's a nice little bug right there. I actually found a couple that were taking up residence in this. So yeah, just a glass reed switch, super simple, super cheap. So this right here is the temperature and humidity sensor, and surprisingly enough, it seems like it's actually a fairly decent temperature sensor. It's the SHT21. Looks like it's made by Centron, and has a has an accuracy of plus or minus 2% on the humidity reading, and plus or minus 0.3 degrees C on the temperature reading, and not necessarily a cheap sensor either. They go for about $5 in quantities of 100 on DigiKey. So I suppose if you're going to get anything right, even in a cheapy weather station, it's temperature and humidity is probably the one thing you do want to get right. So this spring here is actually the antenna for the transmitting radio that transmits the data to the indoor unit. And these are fairly well understood. A lot of people have done a lot of hacking on these to actually decode, so you can use other things like Raspberry Pis and stuff to read the weather information that's being transmitted. They run off 433 megahertz. This one is obviously version 2 of that board and has a date code of 2013. There's a couple of black blobs here. The bigger one's probably the main processor. Not sure what the smaller one would be, but that bigger one's probably the main processor that processes all the data. So there's actually a second radio in here, and this threw me for a second is why there would be 2. You've got the one here that's transmitting the data to the indoor unit, and is clearly the 433 megahertz radio based on the antenna and stuff like that. But this other one with the ferrite core antenna, and that's actually sort of what gave it away, is that ferrite core antenna, because other devices that I've seen, the indoor unit sets itself to the atomic time signal that's being transmitted out of Fort Collins, Colorado. So, and that it makes sense that that they would put the radio for receiving that signal outside, because you want it's not a weak signal, but it's not the strongest in the world. So you want a clear view, and you want to make sure that there's no obstruction. So putting that outside and then transmitting it with the rest of the weather data makes a lot of sense. So we'll take the the rest of the board out. There's probably nothing underneath here. We'll take a look. Actually, there is a crystal under there, just sort of almost looks like an afterthought. And that actually becomes a sort of a theme of this, is that you've got this crystal, and then you've also got this capacitor that's hanging off the side here. We'll find later that there's actually a lot of really bad soldering on this. So definitely made down to a price. And also, interestingly enough, the board, I mean, this unit sits outside, and the board, I mean, it doesn't show any signs of any sort of water damage or anything like that, or condensation or anything, but surprisingly enough, there's no sort of any conformal coating or any sort of protection. But I guess it's buried sort of inside of the housing, so and like I said, there's no signs of any damage or anything like that, so I suppose it works. But you can see here, there's just a close-up of the board. Here's the transmitter for the weather data. Like I said, date code of 2013. I think I probably got this in 2014 or somewhere around there. And it was working when I took it down, so yeah, just got a slightly better model. It does wind speed and direction, or wind direction and rain. So you can see the connectors for the SHT21 and the reed switch there. The SHT21 uses I2C for its communication protocol. Another interesting thing is that those radio boards are sort of look like they're connected with headers, so it's obviously sort of a modular board. Here's our big black blob. That's probably the main CPU. There's a selector switch for the quote-unquote channel. It actually doesn't change the channel. These transmit all on 433 megahertz. It doesn't change the channel. It just adds some encoding so that if you change it to the ABC designator, then it just changes. Other stations would ignore it. Depending on the setting you have. You set the indoor and the outdoor unit to the same, and if they're not the same, then the indoor unit just basically ignores the data that's being transmitted. So here's that crystal that's just sort of almost seems like it's an afterthought based on the proximity of maybe for the main processor, but it's kind of interesting. Some of the construction on this, you can actually see right here. It's terrible solder joint right there, and that's not the only one, but they didn't even completely cover the pad. Obviously, like I said, it's a working unit. It wasn't causing a problem, but still, there's some bad. I don't know if you can necessarily consider that a bad, but it's just not a very clean solder joint right there with that blob of solder just sort of hanging there. But again, interesting that these use the headers like this, and we'll see later on, particularly in the indoor unit, that there's a lot of empty, unpopulated pads. So these are probably, I said, fairly modular and different. They make one board that works in several different units, or different models. So here's the indoor unit, and nothing immediately exciting, but we've got a couple boards, in here, and got the one board here, which is actually just a selector switch. So for the the quote-unquote channel selection, and got. Trying to situate this thing. The negative lead there is fairly short, especially considering the length that the positive lead from the battery is, how long it is. But they made that negative lead short, so I'll cut it off here and see if I can set this, manage it a little bit better. So yeah, so the indoor unit does indoor humidity and barometric pressure and indoor temperature as well. So this copper wire here, and that board, that smaller board there, is the receiving radio for the indoor unit. So the outdoor one is labeled TX. The indoor unit is labeled RX. So that obviously makes sense. And then we've got the bigger board that the radio is plugged into, and then another board. And I'm trying to. It's interesting, and we'll find out later that why there's two boards. But this white tab here is pretty sure that's the humidity sensor for the inside. Not a very sophisticated humidity sensor there. And then this smaller board here, that's probably the barometric pressure sensor. Not a discernible part number on that I could at least find anything on. Definitely cut some costs in this using a cheaper temperature sensor, or a humidity sensor, and temperature sensor. The temperature sensor is actually to the right of that white tab. So we'll take the board on the right off here first. Again, the construction on this is sort of odd with that capacitor just sort of sitting where it is. I guess maybe they didn't have the headroom to sit it up closer to the board and vertically, like I guess you normally would. So we've got a zebra stripe here that connects to the LCD, and there's two. So I'm wondering if each board controls one half of the LCD. You've got two blobs here. The bigger one, based on where the traces are going, is probably the display controller. The smaller one might be a processor for processing the data from the temperature sensor and humidity sensor and barometric pressure sensor. It's kind of interesting that they would use two separate boards like this, but again, it may be that it's modular. So depending on what indoor unit they're pairing with the outdoor unit and such, it may be that they use different boards, and depending on the display layout and things like that. But yeah, we'll see here when we get this the left-hand side board off, if that's actually the case. The one screw here is stripped. It was actually, I don't think I stripped it, but I think it was stripped before I even got to it. So that's sort of interesting. We'll get some pliers here and at least get it started, and we could probably go back at it with the screwdriver here. So yeah, there's another zebra stripe, and on this board there's only one blob, so that's almost probably definitely the case. This is probably just controlling the display, and on that second board, the right-hand side board, it's probably got the blob. The bigger blob is probably the display controller, and that smaller blob is probably a processor for processing the data from the indoor sensors. We'll take a closer look at each of these boards, but you can already see that there's some unpopulated pads on this, which is interesting. Again, probably set up as a modular design depending on what display model or version that these go in. But sort of nonetheless interesting. We'll also see that the construction on this is fairly terrible, especially in terms of the soldering. quality when we get to the close-up images. So here's some of the unpopulated pads. Again, probably just part of a modular design. There's one pad here that looks like it might be for a small processor or sensor or something down there towards, it's in the middle of the screen now. Again, the construction here, you'll see, you can see those where that ribbon cable is coming in. The soldering is just abysmal, not even completely done. I suppose it's a good thing that this isn't in any sort of environment where those would be moving around or flexing or anything, but just throughout you can see. In fact, some of those surface mount components almost look like they were hand done, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but just goes to sort of the quality of overall of the unit. Definitely built down to a price, as you would expect. Again, these things go for, depending on the time of the year, but like around Christmas, you can pick one of these up for $20-30 or sometimes even less than that. So this is the right hand board, and again, I think this is probably doing the that second blob on here is probably the processor for processing the data from the indoor sensors and the data from the radio. And here is that capacitor that's just kind of just hanging out there. Again, a bunch of unpopulated pads and some more examples of really bad soldering. There's obviously no quality control in the Acurite manufacturing facility. Some test pads right there. And hey, look, another example of some really bad soldering. Like, I don't even know how. I mean, there just must be no quality control, because I don't know how something like that would have passed if there was. But there's a humidity sensor and the temperature sensor. Obviously, again, cutting some costs. They don't care that the temperature and humidity sensors aren't as good for the indoor unit as they are for the outdoor unit. I suppose it makes sense. Most people are probably getting these to measure outdoor weather rather than the weather inside. And then there's the barometric pressure sensor. Again, couldn't find any information on that. I suppose there may be a part number or something underneath. I'd have to desolder that to see if I can find out. Again, also interesting is the fact that they like that crystal and capacitor and the humidity sensor are just just flapping around in the breeze. They're not held down by hot glue, at least, or Celastic or anything like that. So this is a close-up of the other side of the board. Again, those must be there's maybe some trimming or some adjusting resistors or something. I noticed that the board up towards the top says unadjusted. So, and again, just messy soldering. These look like they were probably added after the main. We've got some flux residue there. So I've got some pads that are just had components on them, but then were taken off for some reason. Again, it's really surprising when you open things like this up and you see the absolute abysmal build quality. But I mean, again, this isn't a thing. It sits on your desk. It's not under any sort of like major stress or anything like that. So I mean, you suppose you could argue that it's not a big deal. But when you see stuff like this, it makes you question, how accurate is this weather station if they build it to this quality standard, where you can have something that's not even sitting properly on the board. Again, header pins, modular design, obviously. Yeah, But and again, like going back to the outdoor unit, it's interesting that that wasn't have any sort of coating on it, any sort of weather protection, O-rings or anything. This other board is just for on the display, front of the display here is just for the buttons to select the different display modes. So probably nothing special under there, so I won't take that off. I will go ahead and take the display out so we can take a look at that. But it's just going to be a big piece of glass. I do find it interesting that they chose to use two separate, just cut the display in half. I'm not sure that exactly makes sense to me, or in terms of just, it seems like it would be easier just to make one single display. But again, if you can get a display controller, maybe they can get the individual or the separate display controllers cheaper versus buying one controller that could control both displays, and one processor that control both displays at the same time. So kind of interesting. Again, that's why you take these things apart, because you find weird and interesting things like this. So yeah, a big piece of glass, zebra stripes, and then obviously a way to cut down the amount of information that has to be displayed on the screen is actually have those some of the markings actually permanently on there, so that they can just, like with the moon phase and stuff, they can just fill in those specific parts of that moon phase that they need to. So anyway, so yeah, that was the teardown of the Acurite. Let's see here, Acurite 3N1TXCA1. Again, not a bad weather station. And like I said, it continued to work when I took it down, and it was up there for a couple of years, actually, even on the same batteries, which is actually pretty impressive. So a decent weather station, but I would say that having the rain and the wind direction information is definitely worth the upgrade. Some surprising things in terms of build quality. It's kind of like anything else. These are built down to an absolute bare minimum price point. Make them as cheap as possible. They can make as much money as possible. Again, you pay $30-40 for a unit like this, depending on the on a sale. It probably costs some $12 to make, if that. It is nice to see that they actually do use a fairly decent quality temperature and humidity sensor for the outdoor unit. Again, on the indoor unit, some sort of, I guess maybe you can argue, some slacking off on the quality of the sensors in there. But again, the idea of something like this is to measure the outdoor weather. Obviously, that's its primary function. So, but yeah, you have components that are flapping around and just some odd and questionable construction and soldering techniques. But like I said, it works. I guess that's kind of the point. But anyway. So that was a look inside of this Acurite weather station. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Of course, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this and some other videos. And I will see you next time.